somebody who was really despicable, they'd say, why don't you go out and get Lee Van Cleef? He's probably played more villains than any other person in motion pictures.
For decades, Lee Van Cleef's intense presence defined an entire era of Western cinema.
But there's no challenge now. They look at me and I'm an old bald-headed man. You know?
But 35 years after his passing, a shocking revelation from his own son confirms what fans long suspected. Was it the iconic image that broke him, or something deeper? Why did he hide it? How did it shape his life and death? Get ready to uncover the hidden chapters of Van Cleef's journey, the struggles he buried, and the truths that could rewrite his legacy forever. The face that hid the pain. Lee Van Cleef's career was built on a single, unforgettable feature: his face. Angular, intense, and unmistakably menacing, his sharp cheekbones and icy stare became Hollywood shorthand for danger. Directors didn't need to give him many lines. His presence alone could strike fear into the hearts of viewers. It's no surprise that Van Cleef became the go-to villain for spaghetti westerns, earning roles that often cast him as ruthless slayers, cold-blooded mercenaries, or silent men with deadly intentions. But what audiences never saw was that the man behind those cold eyes had already lived through a very different kind of war, one that left permanent marks both seen and unseen. Born in Somerville, New Jersey in 1925, Van Cleef came from a modest background. His father worked as a pharmacist, and his mother was a concert pianist. Far from the dusty frontier towns of the movies, his early years were marked by discipline and hard work. After graduating high school at just 17, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1942, right in the middle of World War II. Assigned to a submarine chaser and later to the USS Incredible, a minesweeper, Van Cleef was deployed across the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and finally, the Black Sea. These weren't ceremonial assignments. He faced combat, dangerous missions, and witnessed the brutal reality of war. He served with distinction, earning the Bronze Star and a series of campaign medals. By the time he returned home in 1946, he was a decorated veteran. But not all wounds are visible. The Navy gave him a uniform, a purpose, and a patch that marked his service. But what it also left behind was something no medal could fix. Like many soldiers of his generation, Van Cleef returned from the war carrying invisible scars, what we would now recognize as symptoms of PTSD. He didn't speak publicly about the emotional cost of what he'd seen overseas, but those who knew him noticed a certain guardedness. His intensity wasn't just for the screen, it was part of him. The same icy glare that audiences feared might have been shaped in part by nights on the open sea, by near-death experiences, by the weight of survival. Still, Van Cleef didn't wallow. He tried to settle into civilian life. Living with his wife Patty in Somerville, he worked regular jobs until a co-worker suggested he audition for a local theater group. That would have turned around the fate of his life. On a high stage, with a stony countenance and heavy presence, he was soon caught by all eyes. Then, like just that, to New York City to perform such act, that man could see agents of film producers wanting him. That's how audiences were introduced to him in the classic 1952 High Noon, when he didn't utter a single line of dialogue, and instead made everyone squirm just by looking at them. The role launched his career in Hollywood, collecting credits mostly as tough guys and henchmen. But, like any jarring transition, being a sailor to being an actor was not easy in Van Cleef's case. The man had been rather injured while serving in the Army, and the physical tortures required to act, especially in action-filled westerns, did their bit on him. The studio system was far removed from being amenable to such actors with lingering problems of health. He often bore the pain in order to remain above the frustrating conditions that the industry set high in valuing masculinity over weakness. A lot of conjectures went around as to whether those narrowed eyes, that expressionless face, were not some form of act. It was a real-life story, been through so much that every glare, every cold glance may draw from a well of real suffering, real memories, and real loss. Lee Van Cleef's rise to fame wasn't just about talent or timing. It was about survival. Survival through war, through personal battles, and through a system that demanded more than most people could give. His story didn't begin in Hollywood. It began in the steel nerves of a young Navy sailor who faced death and came back hardened. And yet, even that wasn't the worst hardship he would endure. But the war wasn't the only battle he'd fight. A life-threatening accident on a desolate California road would almost end his career and his ability to walk. A crash that changed everything. By the late 1950s, Lee Van Cleef was beginning to solidify his place in Hollywood. While he wasn't yet a household name, his face was familiar. He had appeared in dozens of films and television shows, playing the kind of roles that didn't need introductions, dangerous, unpredictable men who carried menace in their silence. He was building momentum, slowly but steadily, working toward the stardom that would eventually come. But in 1958, everything changed in an instant. While driving home from a shoot in Lone Pine, California, Van Cleef was involved in a car accident that would nearly destroy everything he had fought so hard to build. The crash was brutal. Details of the incident are sparse, but the aftermath was clear. Van Cleef suffered 2 fractures in his left arm and a broken kneecap. These weren't injuries one could shake off, not for an actor whose roles depended on physical strength, horseback riding, and stunts. Surgeons were uncertain about whether he'd walk properly again. Worse still, there were real fears he'd never ride a horse, a foundational skill for any actor working in the Western genre. The accident wasn't just physically devastating, it posed a direct threat to his career. One moment he was on the rise, and the next he was in a hospital bed, staring down a future without the work that had given him purpose. The recovery process was excruciating. Van Cleef spent over a month in the hospital, followed by a long period of intense physical therapy. Every step forward came with pain. But what came with that victory was a quieter, more private struggle. The physical pain didn't vanish after his recovery. His knee continued to trouble him for the rest of his life, and many of his later roles required him to mask his limitations. Riding, walking, even standing for long takes became challenges he would silently endure. And to dull that pain, both physical and emotional, he turned to alcohol. It started as a coping mechanism, a few drinks to take the edge off, to get through long days on set. But over time, it became a crutch. Van Cleef rarely spoke publicly about his dependency, but those close to him noticed the shift. The sharp focus he was known for began to blur. Some directors learned to work around his off days. Others quietly removed him from casting consideration altogether. With each film set, alcohol walked beside him, never far behind. While it did not seem so dramatic as to make the tabloids, it was a persistent specter. Van Cleef found himself wondering about something every actor dreads. Have I already peaked? To come back from his injuries was one tremendous fight. The other was the bill that was being presented to him. By cameras, he smiled and went through with the same intensity he had shown on screen. Off-screen was carrying the heavier load, the pain, the fear of fading into absolute insignificance, and the slow realization that he may never be able to get over it. But this was a man who, in World War II, had defied and triumphed over death. No way was he gonna quit. So Van Cleef started doing little roles, sometimes uncredited, to slowly get back into the business. Each time he entered the frame, he was reminding people, and maybe himself, that he wasn't done yet. But something was taking root, besides interest in rabidly pursuing the light. A second addiction. One that seemed harmless on the surface, but would prove to be even more destructive than the bottle. As his body healed, Van Cleef made a fierce comeback. But the man who returned to the screen wasn't the same. A new addiction was forming, and it would follow him to every film set. Cigars, smoke, and silent suffering. To fans watching Lee Van Cleef on screen, the ever-present cigar clenched between his teeth was just another layer of his intimidating persona. It was cinematic, raw, rugged, and undeniably cool. Whether he was glaring down an enemy in a dusty Mexican standoff or delivering lines with a gravelly calmness, that cigar seemed as much a part of his character as his cowboy hat or holstered pistol. But what audiences didn't know, what even many colleagues failed to grasp, was that the cigar wasn't merely a prop. It was a dependency, a ritual, a chain that followed him well beyond the screen. His son would later confirm what many had only guessed. Van Cleef smoked constantly, between takes, before bed, during interviews, and in the solitude of his trailer. It wasn't performative, it was personal. The tobacco was his companion in silence, a tool to ease his nerves, a placeholder for all the things he never said. Over time, the habit became inseparable from his identity. On screen, it enhanced his aura of danger. Off screen, it masked deeper vulnerabilities. The same cigars that gave his characters such authenticity were slowly carving away at his health. The consequences came slowly at first, but they were unrelenting. He developed chronic bronchitis, and as the years wore on, his breathing became more labored. There were days on set where he had to pause to catch his breath, moments when the iconic voice sounded strained, as though it came from a hollow place. But even as the physical effects became more pronounced, Van Cleef continued to smoke. Directors adapted scenes to minimize dialogue or built-in breaks so he could rest. Yet he never considered quitting. In truth, he couldn't. Smoking had become part of his emotional armor. By the time the throat cancer was diagnosed, there was almost nothing left of him. His voice was fading, once so integral to his on-screen mystique. But even that way, he continued. He wore a pacemaker. He kept his sicknesses to himself, letting the audience see nothing but the hard-headed gunslinger they had come to love. The irony is that the image he protected fiercely gave him fame, but also trapped him. The stoic character he portrayed on the screen went to be the same mask he wore in life: alienated, withdrawn, untouchable. Underneath was a man grappling with fear, pain, and aloneness. Colleagues who worked with him in the later years recalled how he rarely spoke about his health. He'd sit quietly, cigar in hand, lost in thought. Occasionally, he would smile or offer a dry remark. But mostly, he kept to himself. The loneliness of the Hollywood machine had crept in. The roles were fewer now, and the budgets smaller. Still, he showed up, committed, disciplined, and proud. If his body was failing, he never let it show. There's something haunting about a man who becomes a symbol of strength while privately unraveling. Van Cleef had mastered that duality. The gunfights, the cold stares, the smoke curling from his lips, all of it crafted an image that audiences worshipped. But the man behind the myth was slowly disappearing. And in the quiet hours, away from the cameras, it became clear that what he truly craved wasn't another role, but connection. Real love. A place to be seen not as a character, but as a person. But beneath the cigar smoke and gun belts, something unexpected stirred in Van Cleef, a longing for connection, for love, and for a life beyond the screen. Love, loss, and lonely roads. For all his steely roles and intimidating screen presence, Lee Van Cleef was not the loner he often portrayed. In real life, he craved connection, romantic, familial, emotional. But as with many stars swept up in the punishing whirlwind of Hollywood, that longing often went unmet. Van Cleef was married 3 times, each relationship beginning with hope and passion, but eventually worn thin by distance, addiction, and the relentless pressure of stardom. Fame may have elevated his name, but it came at the cost of intimacy, stability, and peace in his personal life. His first marriage, to Patty Ruth Cayley in 1943, came before the spotlight ever found him. They were young, hopeful, and navigating life together during the chaos of World War II. While Van Cleef was overseas with the Navy, Patty remained his anchor at home. They went on to have 3 children, 2 sons, Alan and David, and a daughter, Deborah. But the pressures of post-war adjustment and the strain of Van Cleef's nascent acting career created cracks. As he pursued theater and slowly worked his way into film, he was away more often than he was present. Long shoots, travel, and financial uncertainty strained the marriage. After 15 years together, they divorced in 1958. The same year, Van Cleef's car accident nearly ended his career. Not long after, he met Joan Marjorie Drain. This relationship would define the peak years of his career. Joan was there during the rise of the spaghetti western era, his most visible and creatively fulfilling period. She supported him through the European fame boom, the grueling shoots in the deserts of Spain, and the unpredictable pace of working with directors like Sergio Leone. But success brought its own kind of fracture. With Van Cleef constantly on the road and under pressure to perform, Joan's role became less of a partner and more of a caretaker from afar. They tried to keep their connection intact, traveling together, supporting one another's passions, but the demands of Hollywood proved too heavy. In 1974, they officially ended their marriage. The cracks weren't caused by lack of love, but rather by exhaustion from a life that never allowed room to breathe. Then came Barbara Havalone. Their marriage in 1976 marked a quieter chapter in Van Cleef's life. The frenzy of the spaghetti westerns had passed, and he was no longer the box office draw he once was. But with that fading spotlight came something he hadn't had in decades: stillness. Barbara brought with her a deep understanding of Van Cleef's emotional and physical state. She wasn't with him for fame or proximity to celebrity. She was there for the man behind the roles. As Van Cleef's health ebbed, Barbara became at once his confidant and primary caretaker. Through bouts of bronchitis, the slow progression of throat cancer, and long stretches in between silence and work, she stayed beside him. Unlike the roller coaster of his earlier marriages, this last relationship was peacefully serene. Away from the glittery life of Los Angeles, they lived in Oxnard, California. By then, he was viewed publicly as a Hollywood has-been, a fading star from the glory days, remembered for some famous roles, but no longer a working actor. To Barbara, he was a husband, an artist, a man wishing to keep his dignity in the face of physical agony and professional obscurity. She was there to help him conserve the little strength left in him while providing something that Hollywood could never give him: unconditional love. Yet you could say that every other relationship came and faded. There was always one that lived to transcend every role, every award, every headline: his relationship to his children, particularly a son. This was the same son who broke the silence years after Van Cleef's passing in order to spill the truth about his father's untold agonies, not to distract from his memory, but to complete it. Still, Van Cleef had one anchor stronger than fame or romance: his children. And it was his son who would finally reveal what the world wasn't ready to hear. The son speaks out. For decades, Lee Van Cleef's image remained frozen in time, etched into film history as the grim gunslinger, the calculating villain, the man with the deadly stare and ever-present cigar. Fans remembered the movies, critics dissected the roles, but what they never heard was the story from inside his own home. That changed when, years after his death, one of Van Cleef's sons stepped forward, not to protect the myth, but to reveal the man behind it. With quiet honesty and deep affection, he confirmed what many had only whispered. Lee Van Cleef was at war with his own body and mind, and he fought that war in silence. In interviews and family accounts, Van Cleef's son spoke about the addictions that shaped his father's final years: the heavy smoking, the quiet dependence on alcohol during times of pain and stress. These weren't part of a Hollywood performance. They were real struggles that Lee carried every day. He wasn't a man who spoke about his suffering openly. He didn't complain. He didn't dramatize. But those close to him saw it. They saw the toll it took, the coughing that worsened over time, the fatigue that lingered long after a shoot wrapped, the persistent haze of cigar smoke that hung around him like a second shadow. To the public, cigars were an iconic part of Van Cleef's persona, but to his family, they were a symbol of something far more personal and far more painful. His son recalled that Lee smoked constantly, whether he was preparing for a role or simply relaxing at home. It didn't leave room for interruption, for safe haven, for the bad habit. It was no affectation, it was the touchstone. A touchstone he just could not give up, even as doctors urged him on to do so. Even with his body shutting down, it had sunk so deep that, even at times with his children, times of stillness and intimacy were often splashed with the perfume of burning tobacco. To his son, less than weak, and rather more quietly resilient, was the portrait painted. The tough guy laying down ruthless slaughterers was, really, a very gentle and soft-spoken father. He wasn't loud, he wasn't demanding. He was gentle, noticing things around the house, often silent. He loved to paint and would spend hours doing so. He painted Western landscapes, entering the bright colors and smooth brush strokes when he wasn't before the camera. He was proud of his family, going back to Somerville now and then in order to take care of his aging mother, ensuring that the roots were never forgotten. This side of Van Cleef, the loving son, the ever-committed father, and the humble artist, was known to very few. His son's decision to finally speak publicly wasn't an act of disillusionment. It was an act of preservation. Because the legend of Lee Van Cleef, while powerful, was incomplete without the vulnerability, without the truth. His battles with addiction, his health struggles, and his emotional restraint didn't diminish his legacy, they humanized it. In a way, they made him more heroic. He wasn't just a performer delivering iconic lines or staring down enemies in widescreen glory. He was a man who bore the weight of expectation, illness, and personal demons, and still kept showing up. And while his family finally confirmed his struggles, Van Cleef's legacy had already taken a life of its own, fueled by a European fan base that worshipped his every move. Europe's unexpected hero. Lee Van Cleef may have been born in New Jersey, but in many ways, his true stardom was forged thousands of miles away. It wasn't Hollywood that made him a legend. It was Europe. After appearing in Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More and the now iconic The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Van Cleef became a household name across Italy, France, Spain, and Germany. In the US, he remained largely typecast as the go-to villain. But in Europe, something shifted. Audiences didn't just see a villain. They saw something deeper, something they couldn't find in most American westerns at the time. European filmmakers, particularly Leone, understood Van Cleef's potential in a way Hollywood never fully did. In Leone's gritty, morally ambiguous world, there were no clean-cut heroes or obvious villains, only survivors. And Van Cleef, with his sharp features and haunted gaze, fit perfectly into that universe. As Angel Eyes, he didn't just embody evil, he represented something more primal, more tragic. The cold logic, the ruthless efficiency, the occasional flicker of conscience behind his stare, it all gave depth to a character that could have easily been one-dimensional. European audiences were captivated. They didn't see a background actor or a second-tier villain. They saw an anti-hero, a man who had lived, suffered, and fought for his place in a brutal world. The success of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly catapulted Van Cleef into international superstardom, and not just briefly. By the early 1970s, he was one of the top 10 box office draws in Europe. Movie posters plastered across Rome, Madrid, and Paris featured his face. His image, gun drawn, cigar lit, expression stoic, became instantly recognizable. In Spain, he was revered. In Italy, he was practically mythologized. Fans didn't just appreciate his performances, they admired his quiet strength, his resistance to the flashy Hollywood system, and the authentic masculinity he projected. To them, he wasn't acting. He was the Western. What made this European embrace even more remarkable was how different it was from his treatment in America. U.S. critics were often dismissive of spaghetti westerns, calling them too violent, too cynical, too far removed from the so-called golden age of American westerns. But in Europe, that was the appeal. The genre was raw, unpredictable, and honest. And Van Cleef thrived in that space. He wasn't polished like John Wayne or classically heroic like Gary Cooper. He was sharp, dangerous, and eerily calm. He represented a new kind of cinematic figure, flawed, complex, and unforgettable. Van Cleef had influence beyond his roles in films. He influenced not only the European arts and music, but also fashion styles. Artists depicted Van Cleef's squint in their paintings, while musicians named songs and albums after him. Directors, particularly in France and Germany, credited Van Cleef with major inspiration. Van Cleef remained a part of the European pop culture long after his heyday in Hollywood. He became a symbol for more than just an actor's resiliency and edginess, silent power, characters who said little but conveyed everything. This acceptance started Van Cleef on his second career. As Hollywood grew cool for him, he found regular work in European productions. Films made in Europe such as The Big Gundown, Day of Anger, and Death Rides a Horse became big hits on the continent. These films allowed him the rare opportunity to take center stage in heroic roles, opportunities that seldom presented themselves on the U.S. film market. He was no longer just the enemy waiting to be shot away by the hero. He had become the hero. But while Europe immortalized him on screen, America forgot the man who helped define a genre. And his final years were far quieter than the life he had once led. The Final Ride. As the 1980s progressed, Lee Van Cleef quietly began his final chapter. One marked not by blazing gunfights or dramatic duels, but by slow decline, mounting illness, and a stubborn refusal to give in. Though the bright lights of his European fame had dimmed and Hollywood had largely moved on, Van Cleef continued doing what he had always done. He worked. He showed up, memorized his lines, lit his cigars, and delivered performances with the same gravitas and focus that had made him a legend decades earlier. But behind the scenes, his body was in steady rebellion. Years of heavy smoking had left his lungs damaged. Diagnosed with chronic bronchitis and later throat cancer, he also developed serious heart issues that required a pacemaker. Simple things, walking across a set, speaking long lines, sitting under studio lights, became draining. But Van Cleef was never one to complain. To those around him, he remained professional, stoic, and intensely private. He masked his suffering the way he always had, through silence, discipline, and performance. Even as his body gave out, his commitment to acting never wavered. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted to keep going. And he did. His later roles were smaller, quieter, often filmed far from the public eye. One of his last notable efforts was the 1984 NBC series The Master, where he played a martial arts expert searching for his lost daughter. The show lasted just 13 episodes before being canceled, but it remains a cult favorite for many of his loyal fans. It wasn't prestigious or critically acclaimed, but it showed something that had always defined Van Cleef's career: determination. No matter the size of the role or the budget of the production, he brought the same level of effort and gravitas. He believed in the work, not the fanfare. By the late 1980s, he was in visible decline. His movements were slower, his face more drawn, but he continued accepting roles, refusing to surrender to illness. He was still working on films, some small action flicks, some forgettable to critics, but none unimportant to him. He kept painting, too, creating vivid landscapes that mirrored the frontier spirit he had once personified. In his quiet California home, he lived with his third wife, Barbara, who supported him through the final battles that most fans never saw. Behind closed doors, he was not the gunslinger with nerves of steel, but a man coming to terms with the limits of his body and the legacy he would leave behind. On the night of December 16, 1989, Lee Van Cleef suffered a heart attack at his home in Oxnard, California. He was pronounced dead shortly after midnight at St. John's Regional Medical Center. He was just 64. While heart disease was the primary cause of death, throat cancer, brought on by decades of smoking, was listed as a secondary cause. His death didn't make massive headlines. It wasn't treated like the passing of a Hollywood legend. But for those who understood his journey, it was a quiet loss resonating through the ages. He will be buried in the Hollywood Hills at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, a cemetery that harbors the remains of most of the film's great icons. 4 words that say more than most eulogies ever could are carved into the gravestone: "Best of the Bad." This is fitting, not only because of the roles he played in the film, but due to the fact that he embodied duality, a man who could intimidate while merely glancing at someone but move with quiet dignity through life, a villain on screen, a fighter in real life, and someone who earned respect not through theatrics, but through sheer perseverance. This is dedicated to the life and times he spent on Earth as more than just an artist or actor behind closed doors. In the end, Lee Van Cleef was not just the man we love to hate. He was wounded by war. He was a loving father. And more importantly, he was a man that lived with more courage than any script could ever show. If you were moved by Lee Van Cleef's untold story, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of legendary stars. Let us know in the comments which actor's story you want us to explore next. And don't forget to watch the next video on screen to keep discovering Hollywood's best-kept secrets.